Throne and Liberty is a free-to-play, cross-platform, tab-target, ability-based combat MMORPG, where you play as a shapeshifter and the weapons you're currently using will dictate what class you actually are. The game was developed by NCSoft and published by Amazon. While it's been playable in Korea for almost a year now, the Western release began a little over a week ago with a paid early access, but it became free-to-play on October 1st. I've personally been really looking forward to this release, despite many people's claims that it will be excessively pay to win. Everything I had seen prior looked pretty compelling. The world seems massive, the large swaths of players participating in combat seemed impossible, and today we're going to delve into the entire new player experience of Throne and Liberty. Today, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth than I normally do and provide you all with every bit of my impressions as a new player to help you decide if this is a game you're going to want to try. Before we get into all of that, I would just like to mention that channel memberships are indeed active. If you've been enjoying my content, this is a great way to show support. If that's not your cup of tea, a comment, a like, a sub, those things help a bunch. And don't forget to join our community Discord linked in the description below. It's the easiest way to chat with me. Now, let's get into it. So, after keeping an eye on the Countdown website and seeing that the game was fully released, you're met with a giant flying whale that splashes across your desktop before you spend the next 10 minutes dealing with technical issues because the game doesn't want to size properly in OBS. Eventually though, you're met with a server select screen. I didn't realize this at the time, but I selected one of the early access servers, meaning that people had already been playing on these servers for a few days at this point. That really didn't matter too much though, as so many people were creating accounts and playing right now, plus I don't really mind being a couple days behind in terms of progress. Afterwards, you're met with a really well done cutscene explaining a bit of the narrative regarding Throne and Liberty. All of the cutscenes, even in-game, are skippable, but many of them are so excellently animated and narrated, so on more than one occasion, I actually found myself watching them in their entirety. This cutscene will seamlessly lead you into character creation. You choose your gender, and then you're met with many options to customize with. It seems a lot of MMOs these days are taking character creation a lot more seriously, with enough options to genuinely be able to make whatever you want. I think this is important. Generally, it's the very first thing your players are going to interact with, and if you can allow the player to feel invested in their character before they even begin playing, that's going to help immensely with their long-term engagement with the game. On the other hand, if you're anything like me, sometimes too many options can be a little overwhelming and feel a little overly complex when I just want to hop into the game. Now, one thing to note here is there is an option to take a picture of yourself and upload it to the game. And the game will try and make your character look as close in appearance to you as possible. I've seen this in other games before, most notably NBA, but never in an MMO. Unfortunately, when I tried to do this, the game was unable to access my files for some reason, and besides, I was happy with how my character looked like Ian Gallagher from Shameless. Without actually naming my character or choosing a class or any sort of other narrative options, the only thing left to do was click Start Game, where once again you seamlessly shift from character creation straight into a cutscene. You're going to notice this is a bit of a theme with Throne and Liberty, as the game features absolutely zero loading screens. We'll talk more about that later on, but the game immediately puts you into combat. You're introduced to the greatsword and the longbow as your two starting weapons, and as you can see, I already have an action bar filled with abilities. I press E to initiate auto attack and the combat feels okay. One important thing to know is that Throne and Liberty was initially going to feature an auto-play system where your character would essentially run around and fight everything without any input. Now, due to well-deserved massive backlash from the hopeful fanbase, they reverted this decision. But as we go through this video, I'll show you instances where combat still sort of feels like it has the remnants of this forsaken system baked into it. Afterwards, the game lets you know you can switch between camera modes with a more fixed camera, imitating the majority of MMOs, or a camera without a cursor that is fixated to your mouse's movement. The next part of the tutorial teaches you to use your defensive ability, and you can know when to activate your defensive ability because of a giant purple circle that begins to close in on the enemy. If you time this properly, your character will actually do a counterattack which may stun or hurt the enemy. Which defensive ability you actually have is dependent on the weapon you're currently holding. Because I have a greatsword, I have the defensive ability Iron Point Parry, which can stun the enemy for a few seconds. Now, I have to admit, having this completely full action bar from the very start of the game is a little overwhelming, as I didn't really know what my skills actually did. I highly recommend that once you pick which weapons you're going to want to use, that you read through all of the skills before building out your action bar. Throne and Liberty does an excellent job of teaching you its systems and mechanics throughout the entire game. However, in this one scenario, it seems to fall a little short, as I didn't understand the best way to utilize my abilities. Now, here the game mentions weapon swapping, which you can do by pressing Y. So I switched to my longbow in order to attack this ranger. But the one thing that's interesting about Throne and Liberty is changing your weapon has no impact on your action bar. In fact, I can have a ranged ability right beside a melee ability and use one of those abilities immediately after the other. Your character will automatically switch weapons with no delay whenever you use that weapon's abilities. So instead of thinking about it like ESO or New World where swapping weapons will swap your entire action bar, instead you have to think about your weapons as more of a combination class and find out what would work best together, as your action bar is most likely going to have a combination of both weapons' abilities. Anyway, next is when you're first introduced to shapeshifting. We'll talk lots about the shapeshifting abilities throughout this video, but basically, your character was imbued with power from a star fragment, and because of that, they can shapeshift in order to navigate the world. The first one you're introduced to is Dash, where you turn into a sort of faster land animal that moves faster and can fit into smaller places. This is essentially your mount in Throne and Liberty, and you can unlock many different cosmetic styles for all of your different shapeshifts, even through just playing the game. After a few more moments of epic cutscenes, small boss fights, etc., you wake up in a tavern, and apparently all of that was just a bad, scaly dream. You're introduced to an unseen Benny, and he asks who goes there. And finally, you can name your character. This actually caught me off guard, as at this point I had completely forgot that I hadn't even named myself yet. Waydot was not taken, so I was happy. Here, you're introduced to the world map, but interestingly enough, this is a different part of the world than where you play the majority of the game. This is still the tutorial, if you will, so it's a little interesting they show you the world map, but not really the world you're going to explore and play in. I have to admit though, at this point the game is already so nicely voice acted. The sound design so far has been fantastic, the graphics are excellent, and I truly was beginning to feel like this is one of the best looking MMOs I've played in a while. It could just be my recent purchase of a new monitor with a much higher refresh rate, but you'll see throughout this video that Throne and Liberty is truly a beautiful game. You can take issue with a million design choices about gameplay or narrative or monetization, but the one thing you have to admit is this game looks and sounds awesome. I mean, just take a look as you step into the open world for the first time, and the giant flying rock whale floats lazily across your screen. I think back to when I was a child, imagining what next generation graphics would look like, and to this day I'm still constantly blown away. I mean, really, what is gaming going to look like in 10 or 20 years? Anyway, here I decided to take a moment and look at some of the menus. As usual with Eastern-made MMOs, you have a lot of menus. We'll get more in depth with every one of these, but initially I took a look at my skills menu, which showed skills for my two weapons, indicating the skills can be upgraded and further unlocks can be earned as I leveled up my character. There's also a codex, which acts as a sort of quest journal / collection system with rewards. The user interface itself is standard and very clean. These days, you don't see too many games taking liberties, no pun intended, with changing much about the user interface. Generally, action bars, nameplates, minimaps, quest info, they're all located in the same spots. And I'm okay with that. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. Anyway, you meet up with Lottie, and she's going to take you into town and show you a chest full of weapons where you can take one of everything. This is how you choose your class. There are 7 different weapons currently, like daggers and greatswords and crossbows, with plans to add more later on. But the combination of weapons that you choose will actually indicate what class you're playing. For example, if you use a staff and wand, your character will be an invocator. Or a sword and shield with daggers will label you as a berserker. Now, you can change and use different weapons whenever you would like, but bear in mind you're going to be pouring resources into upgrading skills with these weapons and your mastery with these weapons. Looking back on my playtime, you really have until you're max level to test out and try every weapon. But once you're level 50, you're going to want to choose a set for certain and begin working on upgrading it. Because everything is going to be catered towards your build, from your armor, your accessories, to your weapon, your skill points. So for now, I just stuck with the greatsword and the longbow, though I do change this slightly later on, but I still felt like I hadn't even gotten a feel for these two weapons that I currently had. The chest, like I said, gives you one of each weapon to hold on to, so I figured I could change them later if I felt like it. Anyways, on with the rest of the tutorial. A few moments later, this man shapeshifted into a giant golem in order to open the gates, and after you're introduced to the grappling hook system. You'll find these little grappling areas located all over the entire map, which can help you to traverse objects, climb to high points of interest, or just shoot you really high into the air. You'll notice throughout the game as you're doing story quests or event quests in areas, you will receive constant voice-acted narrative about what's actually happening. This really helped to keep me a lot more engaged with the story as I played. You can always turn it off if you don't like someone constantly explaining to you what's going on, but it's something I've never seen before, and I actually found it to be quite helpful, especially because the story can progress at a pretty fast rate. I continued to follow Lottie. We fought some evil trees while making our way to a much bigger tree, where I leave Lottie behind and instead follow this Amatoy. Here we go. It's your overly cute, overly friendly anime guide that every game is trying to do since Paimon's success in Genshin Impact. I really don't mind these as a sort of gameplay mechanic, but I really hate the over-cutification of them in terms of art and voice acting. I don't need a high-pitched, cutesy voice in my ear every time I'm trying to do anything. But that's a bit of personal bias that I'm just injecting into this. Your Amitoy is basically a pet. They can heal you by using a resource known as a World Tree Leaf, in which you'll accumulate lots of as you level. But you can also purchase these World Tree Leaves from vendors throughout the game. On top of that, your Amitoy can be sent on missions or expeditions later on. They can apply a passive buff, and you can collect many different Amitoys. And depending on how many of them you actually have, you're going to receive more benefits. Anyway, you and your Amitoy witness the big tree getting attacked by evil forces, and you're going to team up to stop this from happening. Your Amitoy guides you to a cliff in order to introduce you to your second shapeshift, the flying form. Think of it as less of a flying mount and more of a glider. You have a stamina bar that you can use to propel yourself forward or gain a very small amount of altitude. But generally in this flight form, you are just gliding. Now, I'm just going to be completely honest here, it's a little janky. The glider from Guild Wars 2, the glider in Genshin, the glider in most other games feels much more responsive than the flight form in Throne and Liberty. It's very directional and input heavy, so if I press the A key to move left, I will dramatically move left with the crazy animation. It's hard to explain, but if you've played a game with a really smooth glider mechanics and then transition to this, it's a little harsh. Anyway, you make your way through a little bit more combat before finishing off by fighting this giant orc. You talk with some of the friends you made, and this is the completion of the tutorial. One other thing that I'm just realizing is really interesting is that the tutorial introduced us to both the ground and the air shapeshift, but it never mentions the sea or water shapeshift. Anytime you enter water, you'll actually turn into a little otter. I'm not trying to rap right now, but it allows you to swim faster. It's not mentioned in the tutorial at all, which is a little funny, but anyways, we are now introduced to the actual game. You're met with an awesome cutscene that shows you around the world and different parts of the map before you dramatically fly in as an eagle to the Castleton port. Throne and Liberty splashes across your screen before about 1,000 other players load in front of you, and the game tells you to link your account to some sort of Amazon ID. So here I decided to take a look at my character page. As you can see, because I'm using a greatsword and a longbow, it categorizes me as a ranger. Here you can see your stat points and also take a look at some of the secondary skills, which include cooking, fishing, and expedition. There are no professions in Throne and Liberty, and the crafting of armor and weapons and accessories is available to everyone. After that, I took a look at the battle pass. There is a free and paid section, obviously, but here you're going to find rewards from currencies to resources to potions, etc. You gain points from completing daily and weekly and special contracts in order to level up the battle pass. Afterwards, I took a look inside the in-game shop. This uses a few different currencies, but most notably Lucent, which can only be purchased with real-life money. However, it's also the currency that's used on the auction house to buy and sell things with other players, so you can earn your own Lucent through playing the game and selling things. Otherwise, the shop is pretty standard, lots of cosmetics, currencies, services, resources. I'm sure later on there will be a bottleneck system in which you're incentivized to purchase resources in order to upgrade your gear. The real question will be, is that going to be in a few weeks or months or years? How viable will it be to actually play this game as a free-to-play player and still continue with endgame content? We can't really answer that just yet, as the game really hasn't been out long enough, but we can make some educated guesses. Anyway, let's get into actually leveling. By far, the fastest way to level in Throne and Liberty is to participate in your main story quests. They are marked by this purple star, which is indicated on your minimap as well as on your screen if you're in the vicinity. First off, I was introduced to the storage system, though you do start with 130 inventory slots, and in my entire time playing, I actually never filled all of these up. You can also purchase more inventory space with the in-game currency, or gold, called Solent. I was introduced to a few NPCs in the town, and then I saw a purple glowing book. These things are absolutely everywhere, and through collecting full collections of books, you can actually earn in-game rewards. Some are pretty easy to find and get to, and others not so much. Now, here's another really cool way you're introduced to the no loading screen system. This purple star outside of this building indicates that I need to enter an instance. Watch as my character seamlessly walks in from the outside world and into the private instance. Obviously, loading is happening here, but it's really seamless and really well done. It totally adds to the immersive experience of Throne and Liberty. After I finished talking with the lady inside, I went outside, which completed part of the quest and got me to level 2. The leveling in Throne and Liberty is exceptionally fast. You can finish up the main story and get to level 50 in probably 8 hours of casual gameplay. At this point, I was given a stat point to apply to Strength, Dexterity, Wisdom, or Perception. Now, depending on your build will indicate which 2 of these stats you want to prioritize. However, in Throne and Liberty, every stat is important, and it seems as though most builds will utilize a differing amount of all 4 of the stats. Now, here was actually when I decided to replace my greatsword with daggers, which actually turned me into an infiltrator. So anytime you replace a weapon, you have to go and swap out all of the skills in your action bar with the new weapon's skills. It seems like daggers had your typical rogue sort of skills, applying poison, stealth, and smaller damage but faster attacks. I was excited to test out the daggers and happy with the setup for now, though trust me, I did end up changing it again a bit later as well. Anyways, I was directed outside of Castleton and into the open world. I came across my first waypoint, which has to be unlocked in order to be able to fast travel back here at any time. Each waypoint you unlock will also unlock the area completion system for that area of the map. Each part of the map has certain quests and tasks that you have to do in order to complete that area, which will grant you some rewards. Now, this is when I really got into the questing loop of the leveling process. Basically, all of the story quests are defeat this thing, collect that thing, talk to this guy, watch this cutscene, maybe do a little boss fight. Nothing was ever very difficult in the story questline, and you can honestly just fly through it. There are certain bottleneck moments, as you'll see later on, where you might need to achieve a certain level before continuing with the story quest. However, leveling is so ridiculously fast in Throne and Liberty that this was hardly an inconvenience. Oh, and my daggers were super badass, by the way. Still, combat hasn't been very compelling even as of yet. My skills didn't feel like they carried too much weight. Most of them felt like different iterations of the same thing or idea. I really don't have much negative to say about the combat, but I don't really have much positive. It's very generic. It's like if your middle-aged, slightly balding neighbor John, who just started homebrewing, was a combat system. Now listen, I like John, he's a good guy, he let us use his backup generator when the power was out, but he's just a little generic, you know? That's Throne and Liberty's combat, at least so far. Who knows what it might look like more fleshed out in the endgame in some actually challenging scenarios. I might say something entirely different. But at this point, I took a bit of a deeper look into the skills system. Essentially, you see your active skills on the left and your passive skills on the right for both of your different weapons that you currently have equipped. Now, in order to level up skills, you use a resource known as skill growth books, and there are different books for both active skills as well as passive skills. By leveling up your skills, they will also increase in tier and rarity. So right now, all of my skills are green or common. So green growth books will level them. However, after I get my skill to level 6, it will actually upgrade to blue or rare, which will require blue growth books to level up further. This is part of what can make it so difficult to potentially change your weapons later on in the game after you've already dumped a ton of resources and growth books into these skills. Anyway, I continued leveling, unlocking waypoints, traveling the beautiful world. If you take a look near your minimap, you'll actually see a schedule that shows you all sorts of upcoming events like world bosses and dynamic events. At this point, I used the fast travel system for the first time. Though it indicated fast travel was free, later on it will start to consume solent. Though it's a minuscule amount and solent is very easy to come by. Fast travel takes about 5 seconds to cast, and once again, no loading screen. Little bit of rendering lag, but honestly, the no loading is completely awesome. I won't harp on it too much throughout the video, but it's truly quite the experience. And in seemingly no time at all, I realized I was already level 5. So I applied some more of my stat points, mostly going for dexterity and perception, which would increase my damage, accuracy, and crit. You might be thinking that strength would be a good stat for a sort of melee DPS, but actually strength in Throne and Liberty is more of the tanking stat. It's going to increase your max hit points, melee defense, ability to block, etc. Now, one nice thing about playing a game during its initial release is, let's say, hypothetically, the game is just objectively awful, which is definitely not the case here, but hypothetically, at least, there are tons of other players around you to take in the awfulness at the same time. Obviously, MMOs thrive, especially when the world feels populated, lived in, but it was really fun to know that no matter what quest I was doing, where I was standing, there was always other people around. Throne and Liberty does this exceptionally well because there's no server layering or sharding as you might see in other games. Everyone who is online on the same server as you would be visible to you. And in my entire time playing, I experienced very little to no lag. I know there was some server issues on day one with people not getting into the servers they wanted, but I don't think you can name a popular MMO which didn't go through those pains on day one. Anyway, while participating in some more of the story quest, I was introduced to the Investigate system, which is unique. Essentially, you have to look an item over and find its secrets. Your cursor will change to a different option when you find something, and at first I thought this was a really cool system that I've never seen before. However, now having played throughout the entire story, I feel like this was rather underutilized and never fully fleshed out. They could have possibly had some really in-depth puzzles with this system, but mostly it was just move your cursor until it changes and hold it, and then you're done. But anyway, around level 7, I finished the first chapter of the story quests. Whenever you finish a new chapter, you're able to claim some final rewards from said chapter. This one offered me a nice new set of common daggers, which I had to take. They did more damage and had some better stats, which was perfect. I also unlocked a new shapeshift. Now, this is not like your normal morphs, which provide faster movement or flight, but shapeshifting is more of a collectible cosmetic. I unlocked the Scarab, which would allow me to shapeshift into a scarab. I don't think these really have any utility, it's just a fun sort of collectible thing that you can participate in and unlock to show off to your friends. And at this point, the game directed me to the Equipment Enchanting system, which is essentially how you upgrade or level up your gear and items. Similar to the skilling system, you use a resource, in this case a weapon growth stone, of equal rarity to your actual weapon in order to level it up. The max level of any piece of equipment is level 9, and you'll have different resources for leveling up your weapons, your armor, your accessories, etc. So gearing in Throne and Liberty is done a little bit different than in other MMOs. You don't actually receive new weapons and armor very often. You can acquire new items from dungeons or crafting, which we'll get into, or as very rare drops from mobs out in the world, but you're going to spend a lot more time on leveling up and getting the perfect traits on your gear once you actually receive the item you're looking for. For example, this is a best in slot list for a build I found online. But just acquiring the items here is only one part of the battle. You see, each item has 3 slots for traits in which your build is going to prioritize. Every time an item drops, it will have a random trait, and it might not be the one you're actually looking for. So, for example, if we take Liquiris's Wicked Thorns, which are my best in slot daggers, we not only have to get them to drop in the first place from Liquiris, but we need them to have the correct trait. And on top of that, if we want to add a second and third trait, we'll need them to drop a second or third time in order to actually transfer that trait over to my pair. There are a couple of other ways to go about this, such as trait conversion stones, which are equally fairly difficult to acquire, but you get the gist. Just getting the gear is really only a part of the battle, and that's before you even work on getting your epic items to level 9. Now, as I was leveling, I happened across this open world event, the wolf hunting contest. Basically, every couple of hours there are events that happen across the entire world. They all have different goals and objectives, some are PvE focused and some are even PvP focused. This one in particular had me collecting and delivering wolf tails. Now, not only is this going to grant you rewards such as experience, solent, and resources for leveling up items or skills, in this particular scenario, you'll actually be competing with other players to hand in the tails. So, for example, whoever hands in the most tails will receive more resources and money than someone who hands in the least amount. It's pretty cool. You'll find these events in basically every single zone, and so many times I just randomly stumbled across them and stuck around to get some rewards and to learn about what I have to do. It's a ton of fun and keeps you constantly interacting with other players as well, whether that be in a friendly scenario or a not so friendly scenario. I actually spent so long killing wolves that I got all the way to level 10 from doing so. And this is when I actually realized that I had enough skill growth books to level up my first skill. As you can see, using one of these books will grant you a percentage towards the next level. You can also skip this sort of drawn out cutscene while leveling by pressing escape, and there's also a checkbox here that will use enough books to get you to your next level instead of just doing one at a time. Which is definitely handy because otherwise this process would take altogether way too long. I leveled up my most used skills first and got them all to level 2, which just has a slight stat increase whether it does more damage, applies an effect for slightly longer, etc. I continued leveling and found that some of the story quests were a little bit more involved. For example, this one in particular had me escorting a boy and a group of children down a mountain while protecting them from packs of wolves. It was during this quest I actually switched to my final weapon setup. I went with the greatsword and daggers. This made me a Ravager, and I highly recommend as I started seemingly doing quite a bit more DPS. I was also having fun gliding around the world, not because gliding is mechanically awesome, like I mentioned before it's a little janky, but Throne and Liberty has a ton of verticality. You'll find yourself on top of a mountain or some ancient castle and flying across vast distances and cities to get to where you need to go, and honestly, it's just a lot of fun. So at this point, I was level 12 and it was dark out. Throne and Liberty runs on a pretty fast-paced day and night system that has a huge impact on the game. For example, certain areas during the day are not PvP zones. However, during the night, they are. The day lasts for about 2 hours, while night seems to last for about an hour. Certain events and things might happen at a specific time of the day. For example, you may need to be standing in a certain location at a certain time in order to complete some objective. There's also weather cycles with rain that lasts half an hour, as well as wind, which can block off access to certain areas or make places normally inaccessible accessible. You can really tell the developers want the world to feel persistent, dynamic, and ever-changing. And to be fair, in a lot of ways, it feels just like that. None of these ideas are completely new or unheard of, but in a lot of MMOs, a day and night cycle with a weather cycle can feel like a pain, or a sort of hindrance to just letting you play how you want to play. I didn't find it to be much of an issue in Throne and Liberty, and to be honest, it just added more to the immersion. Oh, also I didn't realize right away, but I had received my first new Amatoy, this little tree guy. When you acquire new Amatoy, you can obviously change the appearance of the one that's following you, but you also get passive bonuses to experience or Solent earned, depending on how many Amatoys you actually have. So next I was directed over to the Starlight Observatory, and this is when you're first introduced to the contract system. Basically, you can accept 5 contracts, which are mini little quests that you have to do in a certain area of the game, depending on which contract manager you go to. These are usually pretty simple, like gather 3 items or kill 10 orcs. But contracts, while not very important while leveling, become a very important part of the game in the endgame. You see, contracts reward you with contract coins, which can be used at a contract merchant to purchase certain items. However, much more importantly, they reward you with something known as Abyssal Contract Tokens. These tokens are immensely important when grinding later on for gear. We'll talk more about that later, but just know you're going to be doing lots and lots of contracts in Throne and Liberty. As you can see here, when you actually have an active contract, the mobs you need to kill or resources you need to gather will have this little gold token above their head. I completed a contract for the main story quest, and this is exactly how Throne and Liberty does a good job of sort of showing you the ropes of most of its systems without expecting you to just figure it out on your own later on. Also, the contracts rewarded me with my first training due points. These are points that are used to level up your mastery with weapons. Mastery is basically a talent tree for your weapons, so for example with daggers I can spec into poison, assassination, or disguise. However, this is more of a long-term goal, and you won't really start accumulating a ton of training due points to level up your masteries until you're level 50 and participating in higher level content. Anyway, a little while later I got to level 15, which actually unlocks the skill specialization system. As if there wasn't enough upgrades and systems for all of my skills already, here is yet another. It's actually pretty cool though. Basically, you get a certain amount of specialization points that you can put into the skills you use the most. This can change how the skill works completely, sometimes turning it into a brand new skill, and oftentimes changing the appearance of the skill. These specialization points are a finite resource, so you'll only be able to spec into some of your skills. Around level 50, you'll have about 100 specialization points. However, you can literally respec completely for free at any given time, so it's not too weighty of a decision. I will admit, some of the default UI in Throne and Liberty is a little strange. You use all your abilities on your action bar constantly, so having them default set 1 through 9 is a little difficult to manage. And as Shift toggles your morph, you might have to be a little creative to find an action bar layout that will work for you. But these are all easily customizable in the menu, so I changed them around with a bit of help from some of my mouse buttons, and it was no issue moving forward. Next, while fighting this comically large goblin who was trying to invade the Starlight Observatory, I finally experienced my first death. I'm not really sure why I died here, as it was easy the second time I attempted it, but death really doesn't do much in terms of penalty. If you die in a quest instance, like this one, you start from your previous checkpoint. But if you die in the open world, you respawn in the nearest safe area, and that's it. Apparently there used to be harsher penalties in previous versions of TNL where you lost experience upon death, but that's no longer the case. Anyway, a little while later I was level 17 and finished the third chapter of the story progression. And here is where you reach your first sort of bottleneck. I have to get to level 18 in order to continue with the story progression. As you can see from my quest guide, you have tons of options continuing forward. These lighter purple starred quests, known as appendixes, will help complete other objectives in your codex, as well as they generally teach you about the game in some way, shape, or form. Lots of these quests act as sort of tutorials. Another option is to just begin exploring the world and completing a bit of the maps around you. Generally, from this point forward, you're going to reach a bottleneck every 5 or 6 story quests, in which you'll have to do some other form of leveling for a bit before you get back to the story. One of my appendix quests actually wanted me to teleport to the Amatoi house. I didn't realize they had a house, but here you'll find a private instance in a nice little cozy house with an expedition map. Here you can send out your Amatois on missions for a set amount of time. Upon completion, you'll gain Expedition XP, which will allow your Amatois to go out further and further into the map. They'll also reward things like resources, currencies, and Abyssal Contract tokens. So you'll want to get working on this and sending out these guys as soon as possible for some decent passive gains, even when you're not playing the game. I'll be honest, I used to be rather hesitant of systems like this in games, where you're coerced to log in and check up on your progress, but over the years and having seen the same iteration in many games, from WoW to even RuneScape, I've softened my opinion a bit on the daily check-in system that this ultimately boils down to. And the progress over time can actually be kinda satisfying. Now, believe it or not, at this point, I had not changed any of my actual equipped armor or accessories. Like I mentioned before, you don't really get these as drops or quest rewards very often. So when I saw that my next appendix quest had me talking to the crafting NPCs, I was excited to finally figure out how to upgrade and get new equipment. Basically, tons of the resources that you get from quest rewards and events are used in crafting. It's not an overly complex system with a million different items, it's actually quite straightforward. There's a few different resources for each type of armor, like cloth, leather, or iron. And it can really be boiled down to just this. Green resources make green items. Green resources can be upgraded to blue resources, and blue resources make blue items, and so on. The 3 rarities, common, rare, and epic, or green, blue, and purple, each have their own corresponding rarity of resources which have to be acquired in order to craft that gear, weapon, or accessory. Now, these items can only be crafted when speaking with the actual corresponding crafting NPC. So, for example, I went to the accessories crafter, where I was able to make myself a necklace of vitality with some of the resources I had gathered so far. There are also items known as lithographs, which basically act as blueprints or plans for whatever piece of equipment you're making. You need an item's corresponding lithograph to be able to make the item, and upon making the item, the lithograph will be consumed. Generally, for common lithographs, it'll be non-specific, so if you want to make a cape, for example, you just need a common armor lithograph. But later on, when crafting rare or epic gear, you'll need a specific lithograph for that specific item. That's about as simple as I can explain it. Trust me, it sounds like a lot of information, but once you get playing the game, it's really quite simple. Oftentimes, in order to craft an epic piece of gear, you're really going to want to go farming. That's what almost everything really seems to boil down to in TNL in terms of gear progression. Oh, you want that thing? Okay, go farm this mob in this area until this drops, because that's part of what's required to make your thing. After I had crafted and leveled up all my new armor, I was pretty happy with my character's appearance. Using daggers and a great sword, I felt like a sort of reckless rogue. And the hooded leather gear definitely fit that vibe. Anyway, a little while later, I got to level 20, and this is actually quite a big moment because you unlock what's known as the Dimension Circle, or essentially group dungeons. Now, if any of you played Terraceland or watched my Terraceland video, you might recognize this system. It's almost identical in appearance. There are dungeons that you can start matchmaking for. On the right side, you'll see all the listed potential loot you can get from completing that dungeon. Underneath is a party matchmaking button where you can choose your role, tank, DPS, or healer. There is a minimum combat power requirement to be able to access any dungeon. For the level 20 dungeon, it was just 600, which was no problem. And in my entire time playing, there wasn't a dungeon I couldn't access once I had the level for it. Now, interestingly enough, when I queued up, there was actually 6 total party positions, not the standard 5 that you find in most MMOs. So a healer, a tank, and 4 DPS for every party. The matchmaking was obviously fairly quick due to the game having literally just released, but I'm not sure what this is going to look like in a few weeks or months. Hopefully these lower level dungeons aren't just completely inactive. Either way, I made my way inside with this lovely group of 5 other players, and we started to take down some of the trash mobs. Design-wise, it seemed like we were in some sort of old abandoned church, fighting Archaeum soldiers. They were not difficult, but admittedly it took a while for us to actually take them down. Now, most dungeons are generally made up of 1 or 2 mini-bosses before you fight the actual boss. So far from what I had seen, the mini-bosses would have 1 or 2 pretty inconsequential mechanics, but the boss fights at the end were actually somewhat difficult, especially for the level 50 dungeons, which we'll get into later. At the first mini-boss in this particular dungeon is where I realized that sometimes I just have skills on cooldown, and there's not much else I can do but wait for my cooldowns to come back. Bear in mind, I have no real build in mind just yet, I'm just playing the game to the best of my ability. Visual clutter during fights is definitely a bit of an issue, especially due to the constant motion blur, but most of the enemies' mechanics are pretty well choreographed with indicators. Throughout these dungeons, you're going to find fire pits which you can light and sit at in order to regain HP and mana. After some of the long-winded fights, you definitely won't be topped up on mana. And even though you can use potions, they have a minute-long cooldown and are not as common as you might think. Regen is actually pretty slow in Throne and Liberty, and it could take a few minutes to actually regain all of your HP and mana if you're just standing idly. But after probably 15 minutes of trash mobs and the other 2 mini-bosses, we finally made it to the final boss room to fight Hillibur. He's basically a Death Eater that will teleport across the room using his scythe to send waves of shadowy stuff in a random direction. He also marks a character with a black circle, which will follow them around, and everyone in the group has to stack together to reduce the damage it deals. Besides that, it's a fairly simple fight. Obviously, it's the first dungeon you're introduced to in the entire game. When the boss is finished, a chest spawns in the room, and this is how you get your loot. I got my first piece of rare equipment, some cloth boots, as well as a ton of other resources from abyssal contract tokens to training due for my weapon masteries. By using the training due, I actually got my first mastery level in both daggers as well as my greatsword, which would allow me to begin speccing into both those weapon types. However, here is where I need to mention a huge gripe I have with Throne and Liberty. Dungeons are dailies. There is a finite amount of dungeons that you can participate in every day before you will no longer get a reward for completing them. As you can see up in the top right corner of my screen, we have abyssal contract tokens to the right, but to the left is a currency known as dimensional contract tokens. When your dimensional contract tokens reach 0 or below 0, you will not receive any rewards from completing a dungeon. You can still participate in the dungeon to help your friends, but there's no incentive as you won't receive any loot. So the level 20 dungeon costs 120 dimensional contract tokens, but the level 50 ones appear to cost 300. As you level up, you receive more and more dimensional contract tokens every day. At level 50, you get 900 per day, meaning you can receive loot from level 50 dungeons 3 times per day. Your dimensional contract tokens also have a cap of 4,500, so you could theoretically save them up for a few days by not doing any dungeons, and then just run a bunch of them on one day. My main problem here is that because this is limited, it could affect finding groups when it's close to the server reset time. Most people will probably use their charges before the end of the day, so the further you get from daily reset, the less and less people that will actually be running dungeons, meaning the longer and longer wait times to actually get into the dungeons. Also, I don't want to have to wait for a lockout to try and get my drop again. For example, my best in slot daggers, like I mentioned earlier, come from a boss known as Liquiris in the level 50 Caves of Destruction dungeon. And if it doesn't drop in my 3 per day lockout, well, then I'm SOL until the daily reset, unfortunately. But anyway, I really enjoyed my first dungeon, and the boss mechanics in this game are really well done. I'm assuming for some people that dungeons will be their favorite piece of content, so why limit that to a daily thing, and not allow for some sort of reward by doing dungeon after dungeon? Anyway, that's my gripe. I'm interested to see if this changes in the future or they add some other content for people who love doing group dungeons like this. Either way, that initial dungeon gave me a ton of XP, but I needed to get to level 23 in order to continue with my story quest, so I decided to run it again. While it did get me to level 23, I unfortunately got a rare sword and shield this time, so no upgrades for me, but overall the dungeon was a good experience. And at this point, I was really excited to level up even more and get access to the level 30, level 40, and eventually level 50 dungeons. So I story quested to level 25. I participated in this awesome timed puzzle in which you had to make your way around these temporary staircases in order to get to the memory orb at the top of the area. This quest finished off with an awesome boss fight that got me to level 26 and rewarded me with this new sword, and actually introduced me to the Guardian mechanic. Basically, from completing certain bits of content in Throne and Liberty, you're going to get access to Guardians. These are essentially an ultimate ability with a 10-minute cooldown. Your character will actually shapeshift into your Guardian, and depending on which Guardian you're currently using, you will gain some sort of buff or ability, and some of these Guardian abilities will massively increase your damage. Some of them will provide you with a shield, etc. There are currently 7 Guardians available in the game, and all of them will provide a massive amount of power for a short period of time, which can really save you in a lot of tricky situations. Around this point in time is when I also learned about some of the solo instanced PvE content, which you can find in the secret dungeon menu. There are 2 options, Title's Tower as well as the Gate of Infinity, which is locked until level 50. But Title's Tower is accessible at level 15, and it's essentially a tower where each floor features a 1v1 encounter against a boss, starting with a level 15 boss at floor 1, and I'm assuming a quite challenging level 50 boss on floor 20. Doing these will reward growth stones, potions, as well as solent and experience. I took down the first boss quite easily as I had already over-leveled this content, but he was a level 15 orc. And afterwards, I proceeded to the second floor where I fought a level 19 spider. Despite being 7 levels higher than the spider, it was still a somewhat difficult fight, so don't expect to just face roll through this tower. Each boss has its own mechanics and challenge. At some point, a couple of friends of mine had logged on to try the game, and we were messing around. We all transferred to the Sanctum server in order to play together, as Throne and Liberty had provided everyone with 3 server transfer tickets for the first 28 days, due to some of the issues that they had with the servers on day 1. It was a pretty nice gesture, and it's an easy way for you to play with your friends, even if they started on a different server than you. Anyway, we decided to make a guild, which only cost about 30,000 solent. We were just joking at the time and named the guild Waydot's Kittens. I guess if you're on the Sanctum server, we are now recruiting. Here's our logo, which any guild you join's logo will always be featured on the back of your character's cape. The wolf is the closest thing we could get to a kitten. Anyway, moving on. At this point, I was level 29 and my story quest was taking me into a conflict zone. This is an area where PvP is enabled, and according to this pop-up, even features penalties on death. I think you might lose a small amount of XP or receive a small debuff. Either way, I stubbornly decided to make my way towards completing my quest, ignoring the fact that other players could attack me. This didn't last too long as I actually got into a fight with a level 27 and I was doing quite well until his friend decided to show up. I fought brave and valiantly, but eventually they took me out. Now, at first, I was a little bit annoyed by this. How am I supposed to get my story quest done when it's located in a conflict area of a brand new game? That seems a little counterproductive. It's obviously going to be packed and people might even be able to camp the story quest location. That's when I realized, however, that conflict zones are another part of that dynamic, ever-changing map philosophy in which they designed the game with. Certain zones will become conflict zones depending on the time of day or if a specific event is happening in that zone. As you can see, when I look at the world map, you can see that this conflict will last for another 43 minutes. And it was getting pretty late, so I just decided to wait until tomorrow to continue my story quest. And sure enough, the next day, it was back to being a peaceful zone, and I was able to continue. Now, I know for a lot of MMO players, PvP is very polarizing. It's either one of the main selling points of the game, or it could also be the sole reason that you don't play a game. I think Throne and Liberty has taken a very cool approach with this sort of constantly moving open world PvP. You're never stuck in one spot, unable to do content for any significant amount of time due to the PvP. And if you want to go participate in the open world PvP, it's always going to be in a different location with different nuances and areas and objectives. Later on, we'll also delve into the instanced arena PvP, but that unlocks when you reach level 50. And I was extremely motivated to get to level 50 as soon as possible. I unlocked the level 30 dungeon, which featured this really cool mechanic where water levels would begin to rise or fall. And because you were in your water shapeshift, you and your party were able to access or block off certain parts of the dungeon as you progressed through it. The end boss was a giant chimera, and I looted myself some more rare boots. At this point, I decided to try out fishing, as it was one of my appendix quests to catch 8 fish. And fishing is quite involved, I'm not gonna lie. Although I've noticed that's a bit of a theme with MMOs lately. I also found fishing in BDO, for example, to be quite involved as well. Maybe I'm just a boomer who loves me some fishing in old school RuneScape where you basically don't do anything except sit around and wait. Either way, I got my fishing to level 2. Fishing obviously gives a ton of supplies for cooking, and as you can imagine, cooking will supply you with food, which grants various combat buffs. From PvE specific or PvP specific to more general damage or defensive buffs. While doing some completion quests in the Monolith Wastelands, I stumbled across a treasure map, which led me to a very specific part of the map, though finding this location is only half the battle. You have to be standing here the moment that night turns to day in order to unlock a secret hidden treasure chest in which you'll be granted some experience for completing the quest, but also another cosmetic shapeshift. We'll have to come back at a later time, and at the right time. Around level 36, I completed the level 30 dungeon again, and for the last time today. As you can see, my dimensional contract tokens were now into the negative. But it was totally worth it, as I got myself a new set of rare blue daggers, which were a massive upgrade. I completed a quest which had me participating in the jumping puzzle from Squid Games. I got myself to level 40, continuously acquiring new skills, leveling up those skills, leveling up my armor, my weapons, my accessories. Unfortunately, because I had already used up my dungeon's contract tokens for the day, I saw no point in attempting to do the level 40 dungeon because I wouldn't get any loot. So I decided to just keep leveling and questing. Around level 44, I stumbled across one of the most difficult puzzles that I had so far completed in Throne and Liberty. You could obviously look up a guide and get this done much faster, but basically you need all these platforms and the golems holding them to line up, so that afterwards you can run directly across them. When I say this took me north of 30 minutes to actually solve, I wish I was kidding. But I guess I'm just a complete idiot because I found this difficult. I had the notepad out and everything. Next, I completed a stealth mission, did some more puzzles, and eventually, after finishing up an awesome cutscene with the flying whale that is so iconic to Throne and Liberty, I was level 50. Now, I still had to finish up the last chapter of the story quest, but this is obviously when Throne and Liberty begins to open up quite a bit. By finishing up chapter 10, your final reward is actually your first epic piece of gear, this epic chest piece. Now, I'm going to be honest here, if I go back and look at my footage from the next little bit, it's honestly a ton of confusion, trial and error, back and forth, and overall mistakes that I made as I tried to understand what exactly I was supposed to do at level 50. I found the game didn't really point me in the right direction, and I was feeling lost about how to proceed with the endgame. So instead of showing you all of my failures, like me dying horribly in Arena, or dying horribly in PvE, or not even being able to take down a level 43 boss in Tatel's Tower because I had messed up my build so much, instead of showing you all of that, I'm going to explain to you all what I now know about Throne and Liberty's endgame, so that you don't make the same mistakes I did. And also, I hope to show you why it's actually pretty compelling and a lot of fun. So here goes. As with any MMO, once you reach the max level, you're gonna really want to start to narrow down the build you want to go for. Find out what items and goals you might want to achieve, and then begin working on that. Now, at first, I found a PvE build online for Ravagers like myself using a greatsword and daggers, but it turns out this build was completely awful. The game is still in its infancy for the Western release, so I must have stumbled across a source that didn't really have much credibility. But eventually I found a build for a PvE and PvP all-around Ravager that could participate in most any and all content, and that's what I began to shoot for. I found a list of the best in slot items, I learned how to acquire all those items, I changed around some of my abilities and masteries in order to come up with a higher DPS rotation, and now I'm going to show you guys how I went about getting some of these best in slot items and figuring out what the gameplay loop really looks like once you're max level in Throne and Liberty. So one of the most obvious things to do first is to try out your first level 50 dungeon. Currently there are 6 available dungeons for levels 50 and up, and each have their own loot. My best in slot list actually required me to go into 3 of these 6 dungeons. And depending on what type of items you're going for, you could easily have to go into the other dungeons as well. Now, the level 50 dungeons are definitely a step up in difficulty from the dungeons that I had participated in prior while leveling. Each of the bosses in the level 50 dungeons have one-shot mechanics that can easily wipe a group if you have no idea what you're doing. The first dungeon I went into is the Cave of Destruction, where basically you fight lots of ants and spiders and other bugs before reaching the final boss, Liquirus, which you might remember drops my best-in-slot daggers, but also my best-in-slot bracers. Unfortunately for me, or mostly my team, I had no clue what I was doing, and I spent the entire fight dead on the ground. So I looked up a video to watch and learn the mechanics. Basically, this boss has a one-shot AoE that requires you to climb up some of the pillars in the room. It's a little more complex than that, but that's the basic idea. Fair enough, lesson learned, don't be that guy going into a dungeon without knowing the mechanics in the slightest. You'll probably die and probably annoy your group. With that being said, and I'm sorry to say this, but my best-in-slot bracers dropped, so I literally got carried for my first epic. The next dungeon I decided to go for was called Butcher's Canyon, where an epic greatsword drops from the last boss. And in between waiting for dungeon queues to pop, I decided to work on contracts. I found the contracts up in Greyclaw Forest and Akadu Valley to be really easy, as most of the objectives were found really close together. This way I could farm resources to level up my new epic equipment while also farming Abyssal Contract tokens. Eventually, I did get into a group for the Butcher's Canyon dungeon, and let me tell you, this boss, Duke Magnus, is no joke. We wiped time after time after time. But my group was persistent, and through trial and error, we were eventually able to start making sense of the mechanics. Basically, Duke Magnus has a set of 3 rings around him. At different phases of the fight, you'll need to jump and avoid these rings in order to reach the outside, where you fight an ad. If you accidentally get stuck in one of these rings, it will freeze your character's movement for a few seconds, and if you stay too close to Duke Magnus in this phase, he will also do a one-shot AoE. Suffice to say, we were in this dungeon for about 45 minutes, if not longer, before eventually I didn't get the greatsword I wanted. But honestly, I had a ton of fun. Initially, I didn't know what to expect from the difficulty of this game. But this dungeon was perfect, because once you really started to understand the mechanics, the fight really began to flow, and it was overall a really well-designed boss. Anyways, afterwards, I was still researching how I could receive more epic gear, and stumbled across something that might be really useful for newer players. Basically, if you take a look at the in-game store, there's going to be a section where you can spend a currency known as ornate coins. Now, ornate coins are acquired in-game for completing collection or map completion content. Somehow, during my entire leveling period, I had acquired almost 900 ornate coins. And these can be used on an item known as the Precious Blessing Pouch. This pouch has the chance to drop epic gear. You can actually buy 15 of these pouches every month from the in-game store using your ornate coins. So I did just that and opened all of them. Unfortunately, I only received one epic item, a chest piece, but not any of the items I was actually looking for. Oh, and remember that secret location I found in the desert in order to unlock a new shapeshift? Well, I went there at the correct time this time, the moment when night turns into day, and I was able to complete the quest and unlock this shapeshift. Awesome. There's actually a ton of cool time-based content like this all over the game. For example, if you're on top of the ruins near Starlight Observatory during the beginning of a new day, you can actually jump onto the flying whale. I made a little joke here with this group of other players looking to fly the whale, but no one seemed to find it as funny as I did. There's actually a quest to complete up here by finding a doll, a ton of mineable resources, and overall a really cool view of the world as you fly around the southern part of the map. The entire ride probably lasts about 10 minutes, but honestly it's stuff like this that really makes an MMO feel like a livable, breathable, existing world. This was such a cool experience, especially with the 20 plus other players who jumped onto the whale with me. It was just a ton of fun. Anyways, I attempted the Caves of Destruction dungeon again, this time actually understanding the fight and actually able to teach some of my group mates who had never done it before. Unfortunately, my daggers didn't drop this time either, but afterwards I was interested in trying something known as the Shadow Crypt. This is an open world dungeon known as an Abyssal dungeon, and this is where my best-in-slot cape and boots would come from 2 of the mobs inside. Also, just so you guys are aware, if you ever want to see what certain mobs drop in certain areas, by using your world map, you can always look up these areas and you'll see a mob list on the right side, which contains all sorts of useful info, including the items the mobs actually drop. Now, I tried to enter the Shadow Crypt solo, and I was able to take down some of the enemies in this area, but this is definitely content that you're going to want to do in a group. Luckily for me, the game is so active at the moment, it was really easy to find a group, and we got to work. This dungeon is absolutely massive with multiple floors, but there was probably another 20 groups going around trying to tag as many enemies as possible. From what I can tell, basically every single class has at least one best-in-slot item coming from this abyssal dungeon. So, while you're in this dungeon, every time you kill an enemy, you're going to notice a decrease in your abyssal dungeon contract tokens up here on the right. If these reach 0, you can still attack the enemies in this dungeon, and you can even still receive loot, though it's going to be at a drastically lower drop chance. So it's always good to do contracts in order to farm these tokens. You don't want to spend much time in these dungeons if you don't have the absolute best chance at receiving the items you're going for. Another thing to bear in mind is, while you're in these dungeons, during the day, they are completely safe for you and your group to continue grinding. But the second it turns to night, every abyssal dungeon is now a PvP zone, which I didn't realize at first, making this death absolutely hilarious, as 1 second I was completely safe and the next second I was dead. Speaking of PvP, at this point I decided to check out the 3v3 arena, of which there is a ranked and unranked playlist. Now that I had a more all-around build, me and my team actually managed to do some decent work, and I got a few kills which resulted in a win. Arena-based PvP is not really my forte in most MMORPGs, but it does seem decently balanced, however very reliant on crowd control and cooldown management. I can imagine at the highest level this will be an extremely competitive and technical piece of content that I most likely will never be very good at. So a bit more grinding with a group in the Shadow Crypt, and I actually got myself that best-in-slot cape I was talking about. It looks really awesome. I'd been wearing my previous cape since like level 15, and since it's the single piece of armor you actually see the most on your character, it was a welcome change. I continued doing dungeons, running contracts, doing Shadow Crypt, and overall really enjoying the gameplay loop of being level 50 in Throne and Liberty, going for my epics and exploring this vast and beautiful world. At one point I realized a world boss event was coming up and decided to head over there. The amount of people in one location, all fighting the same giant boss, with next to no lag, on epic graphic quality, mind you, was awesome to see. This giant boss, Malakar, was no real challenge as long as you mostly remained with the group and stood in the area of effect heals. The fight overall probably took between 5 to 10 minutes. He kinda teleports around and does some mass AoEs. I didn't end up dying during the fight, but a few of my group mates did, and it seemed that they were able to respawn and join the fight again immediately. Afterwards, it appeared that one player out of the entire group received an epic drop. I'm not quite sure if that's intentional or not, but everyone else also receives a reward similar to mine, which was made up of some potions, a mix of rare and epic resources, as well as some other miscellaneous things. There's quite a wide variety of world bosses scattered across the map, so after completing this one, I was excited to see what the other ones were like. But with that, you guys are basically caught up with what I've been doing since I got to level 50. I hope this provided some insight into what you can expect from Throne and Liberty. Now, I'm going to delve into my thoughts and opinions about the game as a whole. I hope you guys enjoyed this more thorough, more in-depth, and a bit of a longer discussion regarding Throne and Liberty. This is much more detailed than most of my reviews, so I would really appreciate a comment letting me know what you guys think about this format. Anyway, let's get into it. Basically, before playing Throne and Liberty, I had some less than positive ideas about what this game might look like on release. Mostly due to the fact that its developer NCSoft doesn't have the best proven track record when it comes to monetization, and the fact that this is a Korean game which was being published by Amazon for a Western release, similar to Lost Ark. And while many of those initial assumptions about potential pay-to-win have yet to come to fruition because the game simply hasn't been out long enough for most players to reach any true bottlenecks yet, we can still safely assume that this is going to be the case later on. But first, I'm going to talk about the game's positives, what sets Throne and Liberty apart, what makes it worth your while, and after I'll talk about some of the things that I disliked or think could be worked on and changed. And I mean, first off, I did not expect the level of depth, detail, and attention that was placed on the graphical design of the world, the beautiful soundtrack and sound design as you explore the world, and even the storytelling and lore that is placed throughout the world. Couple that with the lack of loading screens, the dynamic ever-changing map with a day, night, and weather cycle, and you have yourself a really immersive experience that, for a free-to-play game, is quite impressive. Secondly, Throne and Liberty really surprised me with the amount of open-world content that's available to explore, from dungeons to world bosses to dynamic events to mysteries such as flying a giant whale or finding a chest at just the right time of the day. The world is chock full of things to work on, and completing everything is a gargantuan task in and of itself. This reminded me a lot of Guild Wars 2, and I think it's an awesome design philosophy when it comes to making a living, breathing open world. Finally, what really stood out to me the most was Throne and Liberty's ability to keep me constantly active. Especially once I was level 50 and figured out what I needed to work towards, it never felt like I was waiting around for something to happen. I never felt like there was not something immensely productive that I could be doing right now. This was a problem that I had in Lost Ark, as once I finished most of my dailies and my activities, I really didn't know what to work on next. But in Throne and Liberty, whether it's through your dailies, weeklies, grinds for certain items, dungeons, tower floors, working on secondary skills, sending out your amitoys, going for map completion or collection goals, I really felt like I wasn't running out of content anytime soon. This obviously might change later on with hundreds or even thousands of hours of gameplay as you begin to complete everything, but couple that with the constantly moving event schedule of the day, and honestly, I had a more difficult time deciding what not to do instead of what to do. Now, on to some of the things that I disliked a bit about Throne and Liberty. First off, as a big fan of challenging 5-man group content, being limited to only receiving loot from 3 dungeons per day is a huge problem for me. There is a massive section of MMO fans who will only play MMOs for the challenging dungeon content, and by time gating this, I feel as though they are massively stifling a large portion of the player base from enjoying their favorite content. Secondly, the lack of a true profession and crafting system, and instead having everyone craft their own armor through a really simple sort of process. Purple materials make purple items. It felt a little uninspired and rushed. For a game with so much attention to detail and depth with its open world, I was really surprised to not see a more fleshed out crafting system. Especially in a game that is essentially classless, you're going to be looking for many different ways to really separate your character's identity from other players, and professions is a great way to do this. So in my opinion, Throne and Liberty has missed the mark on this a bit. And finally, we all know it, we're all thinking it, even if it's not the case now, this game will eventually be monetized to the point where as a free-to-play player, unless you're putting in full-time job hours into this game day in and day out, you will not be able to compete with the whales who will undoubtedly be purchasing every resource, experience, loot chest, cosmetic, and what have you that the in-game shop will always be filled with. This is generally the timeline with these games. They start in a place where free-to-play doesn't feel that different from being a whale. But as time goes on and more content is added to the game, slowly but surely the gap between a free-to-play player and a whale grows as well. It's a really incremental growth and you may not notice it in a short period of time, but all of a sudden after the game has been out for a year and many updates have been made, you're gonna realize you just can't keep up with the paid players anymore. Unfortunately, that's the business model for these games. There's not really much you can do about it except to also pay money. We can hope that that won't be the case with Throne and Liberty, or that somehow it might take 2 years instead of just 1 for that free-to-play whale gap to widen, but it is what it is. Anyway guys, with all of that being said, I totally recommend trying out Throne and Liberty, especially right now. The game is free, the population is booming because everyone's still super hyped about it. And once again, I'm going to ask you all to let me know what you think about the slightly longer format. I want to say a massive thank you, especially on this one, if you made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a sub, those things help a bunch, but if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. Anyways, I'll catch you all in the next one. Later.